I had been planning that hike for weeks. It was supposed to be a simple trip, nothing extreme, just a long day out in the mountains where I could clear my head and push myself a little farther than usual. I chose a trail I had never been on before, one that looped deep into a national forest, winding through ridges, valleys, and stretches of dense pines before climbing toward a rocky overlook. From what I read online, it was listed as difficult but manageable for someone with decent experience. I had done harder trails before, but I always respected the land. I packed my gear carefully, checked the forecast twice, and made sure my backpack had everything I would need. That morning, I left early, driving 2 hours to reach the trailhead. The sun had only just started to push above the horizon, painting the sky in a pale orange. The air was cool when I stepped out of the car, and there was still dew on the grass. My backpack felt heavy on my shoulders, but in a good way. It meant I had prepared. I had food, extra layers, a small stove, a first aid kit, headlamp, batteries, and more water than I thought I'd actually drink. I even carried a lightweight emergency bivy sack, because I knew things could change quickly in the wild. First, everything went exactly as planned. The trail was wide and well-marked near the beginning, winding upward through tall trees that blocked most of the sunlight. I could hear birds calling from somewhere high above and the distant rush of a creek that followed the valley. My boots crunched over pine needles and rocks, and I kept a steady pace, enjoying the rhythm of moving forward. The deeper I went, the fewer signs of people I saw. The last hiker I passed was about an hour in, heading back toward the parking area. After that, it was just me, the trail, and the forest. I liked the solitude at first. There was something comforting about the silence, broken only by the occasional sound of wind or an animal moving through the underbrush. I stopped once to drink water and eat a protein bar, then kept going, pushing higher. My plan was to reach the ridge overlook by mid-afternoon, eat a late lunch there, and then circle back down the loop before sunset. It sounded simple enough, but as I climbed, the trail began to change. The dirt path turned rockier, and in some places it was hard to see where the official trail even went. The markers on the trees grew fewer and farther between. At first, I brushed it off, figuring I just had to pay closer attention. I took careful steps and made mental notes of landmarks. A leaning pine tree, a boulder split in half, the sound of running water somewhere to my right. After about 4 hours of hiking, I realized something was wrong. The trail I was following had slowly narrowed until it almost didn't look like a trail anymore. Grass and shrubs had crept over it, and some sections looked like they hadn't been used in years. I stopped and checked the map I had folded in my pocket. According to the map, the main loop should have been clear and obvious. I should have crossed a small wooden footbridge by then, but I hadn't seen anything like that. I turned around, thinking maybe I missed a turn. I backtracked slowly, trying to spot a marker or sign. The forest all looked the same. Rows of trees, patches of moss, and uneven ground covered in roots. After about 20 minutes, I still couldn't find the trail I remembered. The panic started creeping in then, not all at once but slowly, like water filling a cup. I knew the number one rule was not to wander aimlessly, but that was exactly what I felt myself doing. Every direction looked right, and none of them did. I tried to calm myself, taking long breaths and telling myself I had packed well, that I had time, that I had been in worse spots before. But there was a difference between reading survival tips and actually standing in a dense forest with no trail under your boots. I forced myself to sit on a log and drink water. My shirt clung to me with sweat, and the air felt warmer than it had that morning. I decided to keep moving uphill. My logic was that if I could get higher, maybe I would spot the ridge or even the overlook I had been aiming for. I pushed forward, climbing over rocks and pushing through shrubs that snagged on my pants. The higher I went, the steeper it got, and the ground grew loose under my boots. Every step sent small rocks rolling down behind me. I slipped more than once, catching myself with my hands, scraping my palms raw. After what felt like an hour, I reached a clearing. It wasn't the ridge, but a slanted, open patch where the trees gave way to scrub and rock. I could see far across the valley below, layers of trees stretching into the distance. For a moment, relief washed over me. The The sight was beautiful, almost enough to distract me from the fact that I had no idea where I was. But then I noticed the sun. It was lower than I expected, already sliding down the sky. I had lost track of time while trying to find my way back. The shadows stretched long across the valley, and I knew I only had a few more hours of daylight. That's when the fear truly set in. I didn't want to be stuck out there at night. I had a headlamp and extra batteries, but the idea of stumbling through the forest in the dark, not knowing if I was moving closer or farther from safety, made my stomach knot. I pulled out my phone, hoping to at least get a signal, but of course there was nothing, just the blank bars of no service. I forced myself to keep moving, scanning the distance for any sign of a trail, road, or even smoke from a distant cabin. I saw nothing but endless forest. I decided to descend again, reasoning that trails often ran along valleys near water. If I could reach the creek I had heard earlier, maybe I could follow it back. The descent was worse than the climb. The loose rocks slid under my boots, and I had to brace myself against trees to keep from tumbling. At one point, my foot slipped and I fell hard onto my side, the edge of a rock slamming into my ribs. Pain shot through me, and for a moment I just lay there, gasping and clutching my side. I forced myself to stand, wincing, but thankfully nothing felt broken. Still, the ache lingered with every breath I took. By the time I reached the valley floor, the light was fading fast. The forest grew darker, cooler, and quieter. The birds that had chirped all morning were silent now, and only the occasional rustle of unseen animals reminded me I wasn't completely alone. I found the creek at last, its water rushing over smooth stones. I knelt and splashed some on my face, drinking from my bottle after refilling it with my filter. The cold water gave me a small burst of energy, but I knew it wouldn't last long. I decided to follow the creek downstream, hoping it might lead me to a road or crossing. I walked along its edge, stepping carefully over rocks and fallen branches. The further I went, the harder it became. The banks grew steep in places, forcing me to climb up and down, each step taking more strength than the last. My legs trembled with fatigue, and my shoulders burned under the weight of my pack. Darkness fell quickly in the valley. I pulled out my headlamp, strapping it on and clicking it to life. The beam cut through the blackness, illuminating trees and the silver shine of the water. The night air was cool and damp, and every sound seemed louder in the silence. The crunch of my boots, the splash of water, the snap of branches under unseen weight. I kept going until I couldn't anymore. My body screamed for rest, and my ribs ached with every breath. I found a flat spot a little away from the creek and dropped my pack. I didn't want to stop, but I knew pushing further in the dark would only risk injury. I ate a small meal, forcing the food down even though I had little appetite. Then I pulled out the emergency bivy sack, sliding into it on the cold ground. The forest at night was terrifying in a way I hadn't expected. Every sound made me flinch. I could hear coyotes howling somewhere far away, the occasional crack of a branch, and once what sounded like something large moving through the brush. I gripped the small knife I carried, even though I knew it wouldn't do much against anything big. Sleep came only in short bursts, broken by jolts of fear whenever the forest grew too quiet or too loud. When dawn finally came, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. My body was stiff, my mouth dry, and my stomach knotted with hunger. But the sight of the pale morning light gave me enough strength to stand and keep going. I followed the creek again, pushing myself step by step. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher, and the forest grew warmer. My legs felt like lead, and my ribs burned with every step, but I didn't stop. At last, I saw something ahead that made my heart leap. An old wooden bridge, half rotting but still standing. It crossed the creek at a narrow point, and beyond it, I could see a faint dirt path winding upward. I nearly cried when I stepped onto that bridge. The boards creaked under my boots, and for a moment I thought they might give way, but they held. On the other side, I followed the dirt path, and slowly it grew wider and more defined. Trail markers appeared again, faint but real, painted on tree trunks. I had found the trail. The hike back felt endless, but I knew I was moving towards safety now. My legs shook with every step, and I had to stop often to catch my... I had been planning a long hike for weeks, something to take me far from noise, traffic, and the constant routine of work. I wanted silence, forests, dirt under my boots, and the feeling of being away from everything for a few days. I picked an area I had never been to before, a mountain trail system that stretched for miles through deep woods, ridges, and valleys. The maps showed lakes, streams, steep climbs, and rough terrain. It looked like the kind of place where I could test myself, camp alone, and feel that mix of freedom and unease that only comes when you know you're really out there. I left early in the morning, parked at a small dirt lot, and started up the trail. The air was cool, the sky clear, and the first part of the trail felt welcoming. It was wide, well-marked, and followed a steady climb through tall pine trees. I had a heavy pack with food, water, a tent, sleeping bag, extra clothes, and enough supplies for 3 days. My plan was simple: hike most of the day, find a spot near water, camp, then move deeper the next day before looping back out. The first miles went easy. I passed a couple of other hikers in the morning, but soon the trail thinned out and the woods grew thicker. By noon, I had already climbed high enough that I could look out across rolling hills and valleys. The sun was warm, and the air smelled like pine needles and dirt. Everything felt right. By late afternoon, I had gone farther than I thought I would. The trail markers became less frequent, and the ground steeper and rougher. My legs burned, but I felt strong, like I was finally getting into the part of the hike where it was just me and the wild. I found a small clearing near a creek and set up camp. I boiled some water, ate, and sat by the creek listening to the steady sound of running water while the forest around me grew darker. When the light finally drained away, I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and let the weight of the day sink into my body. I woke early, packed, and headed farther up the trail. The second day was harder. The trail turned narrow and wound around rocks and roots. Several times I had to slow down just to figure out which direction the markers were pointing. Still, I liked the challenge. I pushed deeper, the forest around me growing thicker, the air quieter with fewer signs of people. By midday, I realized I hadn't seen anyone since the morning before. That didn't bother me at first. It was part of why I came. But as I kept climbing, I noticed how rough the trail had become. Some parts looked washed out. Fallen trees blocked sections. In a few places, the markers were faded or missing. I had to check my map often, making sure I was still on the main loop. When the afternoon came, clouds began rolling in. The sky darkened, and the air shifted, heavy and cool. I knew I had to think about camp soon, maybe find a spot before the rain started. But the trail didn't make it easy. The ground dropped steeply down one side, and thick trees closed in on the other. For nearly an hour, I found no flat ground at all. Finally, just before the first drops began to fall, I found a hollow where the trees thinned a little. The ground was uneven, but I managed to pitch the tent and crawl inside just as the rain picked up. The sound of it hitting the fabric was constant, mixed with the wind through the trees. I lay there, tired and damp, listening to the storm. By morning, the rain had slowed, but the ground outside was soaked. Mud stuck to my boots as I packed up and tried to push on. The trail had turned slippery, roots slick, rocks shining with water. I moved slower, careful with each step. I checked the map again and again, but something felt off. The markers I had counted on were barely there now, and in places they seemed gone completely. Around midday, I came to a split in the trail that wasn't on my map. One path looked wider but dropped steeply down. The other cut across a ridge, narrow and rocky. I hesitated, studying the map, trying to make sense of it. In the end, I chose the ridge, figuring higher ground would give me a better view if I got turned around. That was the choice that started everything. The ridge was rough. The trail seemed less like a trail and more like a worn path that might have been used years ago. Twisted between boulders and thick brush. In places, it disappeared completely. I pressed forward, marking in my head the features I passed so I could backtrack if I needed. But as the hours went by, the path only grew fainter. My map no longer matched what I was seeing. When I stopped to check my compass, the realization hit hard. I wasn't sure where I was anymore. The first wave of fear came then. Not panic, but that cold tightening in the stomach that says something is wrong. I took a long drink of water, ate a bar, and tried to think clearly. I decided to turn back to follow my own footprints if I could, and find the split again. But the rain and mud had washed much of the ground clean. In places, my tracks were gone. I retraced as best I could, moving slower, eyes scanning every rock and root, trying to remember exactly how I had come. But after an hour of this, nothing looked right. I was lost. The woods seemed different now, darker, heavier. Every sound, branches creaking, water dripping, felt louder. My pack weighed more. I knew I couldn't keep wandering aimlessly, so I tried to steady myself. I checked my compass again and picked a direction that seemed downhill, figuring it might lead to water or a clearer path. Hours passed. The ground grew rougher, and thick brush tore at my clothes. My legs ached. My shoulders burned. I slipped once on wet rock and nearly twisted my ankle. The fear was constant now, not sharp but steady, pressing on me with every step. By late afternoon, I found a narrow stream. Relief rushed in because water always means some kind of path. I followed it downstream, thinking it might lead to a bigger creek or even back to the main trail. The stream twisted through thick trees, over rocks, and under fallen logs. I stumbled along its banks, slipping in mud, clinging to branches to stay upright. As the light faded, I knew I had to stop. I cleared a space under the trees and set up my tent. My body shook with exhaustion. I ate quickly, more from need than hunger, and crawled inside. But sleep wouldn't come easy. The sounds of the forest pressed in on me. The constant trickle of water, the cracking of branches, the rustle of unseen movement. Every sound made me stiffen. The night stretched long, broken by restless half-sleep and sudden jolts awake. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving close to the tent. I held my breath, staring at the thin fabric, but when I unzipped it later with shaking hands, there was nothing there, only darkness and trees. Morning came gray and damp. I forced myself up, packed, and kept following the stream. My water filter kept me supplied, but my food was dwindling. The forest seemed endless, twisting in every direction. The stream grew wider, harder to cross, with slick rocks and deeper pools. By the third day lost, I was moving slower, weaker. Blisters burned on my feet. My shoulders throbbed under the pack straps. I slipped often, sometimes going down hard, covering myself in mud. The fear had become something steady now, a dull ache in my chest that never left. That afternoon, I came across the first real sign of people I had seen in days. An old fire ring, half buried in moss and leaves. It looked abandoned for years, but it lit something in me, proof that someone had once been here. I stayed near it that night, feeling a small, fragile sense of safety. But the next morning, I made a mistake. I decided to leave the stream and cut uphill, hoping it would connect with a clearer trail. The climb was brutal, steep, and endless, and by the time I reached the ridge, my legs trembled. From up there, I could see nothing but trees in every direction. No roads, no buildings, no clear sign of a way out. I sat there a long time, drained. The silence was crushing. I thought about the parking lot, the car waiting, the world just miles away but unreachable. With no other choice, I climbed back down, found the stream again, and kept following. Day after day, the same endless struggle. My food nearly gone, my body thinner, weaker. My thoughts darkened. I knew if I didn't find a way out soon, I wouldn't have the strength to keep going. On the fifth day lost, I heard something new, a distant hum, faint but real. I froze, listening. Came and went with the wind, but I knew it wasn't the forest. It was mechanical. I forced my body forward, chasing the sound. Hours later, I stumbled into a clearing where power lines cut across the trees. I nearly cried at the sight. Civilization, a way out. I followed the lines, tripping, falling, dragging myself forward. By evening, I reached a dirt service road, and from there, after miles of staggering walking, I finally came to a paved road. Car passed. I raised my arms, weak and filthy, and it stopped. The driver helped me, gave me water, called for help. My body felt like it was shutting down, but I had planned the hike for weeks. It was not supposed to be anything extreme, at least not at first. The trail I chose was well known, mapped out, and popular among solo hikers who wanted a challenge but not something too dangerous. I had been hiking for a couple of years, and while I wouldn't call myself an expert, I was fit, careful, and disciplined about preparation. I packed everything the night before: my tent, a sleeping bag, layers of clothing, food that would last for 3 days, a water filter, a headlamp with spare batteries, a paper map in case my phone lost service, a first aid kit, a knife, and even an emergency blanket. I felt ready, and as I went to sleep the night before, I was excited rather than nervous. The morning of the hike was clear and cool. I started driving early and reached the trailhead by mid-morning. The parking lot wasn't empty, but it wasn't crowded either. I saw maybe 4 or 5 other cars scattered around, which reassured me that I wouldn't be completely alone out there. Still, the area was large and remote enough that once I got deeper into the trail, it was very possible I wouldn't see anyone for hours. That was part of the reason I loved hiking. The stillness of being far away from roads, from houses, from the sound of machines, made me feel both small and free. I locked my car, adjusted my backpack straps, and began. The first couple of miles were easy. Dirt paths lined with tall trees, the smell of pine heavy in the air, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. I stopped often, not because I was tired, but because I liked to look around. Sunlight filtered down in sharp beams, the air felt damp and cool, and everything was so quiet except for the sound of birds high above. The trail gradually grew steeper, but I welcomed the burn in my legs. I felt alive. As hours passed, I covered ground faster than I thought I would. According to my map, there was a ridge point about 7 miles in where I planned to stop for lunch. It overlooked a valley, and the idea of sitting there, alone with my food and the view, had been motivating me all morning. When I reached it, the view was even better than I expected. The valley stretched out for miles, with ridges rolling one after another into the distance. I could see patches of sunlight moving as clouds drifted overhead, and far below, a thin ribbon of water reflected the sky. I sat, ate, and drank water. Everything felt right, but that's where things started to turn. When I was ready to move again, I pulled out my map. I noticed that the main trail looped further ahead, but there was a thinner line drawn faintly across the page, a side path, less maintained but marked nonetheless. I remembered reading about it online. It cut across the ridge and rejoined the main trail miles later, shaving some distance off but also being rougher and less predictable. I hesitated, looking at the line. I had plenty of daylight left, and I thought it could add some excitement to the trip. I decided to take it. The path started clearly enough, though narrower and overgrown. Within half a mile, I realized this wasn't used nearly as much as the main trail. Branches brushed against my arms, thorns snagged my pants, and fallen logs forced me to climb awkwardly over them. The ground sloped downward in uneven ways, and more than once I slipped on loose dirt. Still, I told myself I could handle it. I moved slowly, checking the map often, confident I was still following the correct route. After another hour, things became less certain. The trail was harder to see, more like faint impressions in the dirt rather than a path. I came across a dry creek bed that wasn't on the map, and I couldn't tell if the faint marks I followed had simply vanished or if I had missed a turn. I stopped, breathing heavier than before, and studied my map again. I felt a small unease in my stomach. I wasn't lost, not yet, but it was clear this wasn't going to be as straightforward as I thought. I decided to keep moving downhill. I told myself that downhill usually led to water, and water often connected back to trails or at least valleys where orientation was easier. For the next hour, I descended, stepping carefully over rocks and roots, brushing aside branches, and trying to keep track of my direction. My phone's GPS flickered in and out, useless. It was sometime in the afternoon when I admitted to myself that I wasn't sure where I was anymore. The faint trail had disappeared completely. I hadn't seen any markers, no signs, nothing man-made for hours. The trees pressed closer together, taller, blocking out more sunlight. Every direction looked the same, endless forest and sloping ground. My stomach tightened, and for the first time I felt real fear. I tried to calm myself. I wasn't injured. I still had food, water, and gear. I could spend the night if I had to. All I needed to do was think carefully, not panic, and retrace my steps. So I turned around and began climbing back uphill. But retracing was harder than I expected. The ground looked different when seen in reverse. Spots that I swore I had passed earlier looked unfamiliar. I stopped multiple times, turning in circles, trying to match trees or logs with my memory. Nothing looked right. The hours bled away like that. My legs grew heavy from the climbing, and sweat soaked my shirt. I had been confident in the morning, but now I felt foolish. The map was useless without landmarks. The sun had shifted, and shadows stretched long, making the forest look even more confusing. At some point, I had to face it. I was lost. I forced myself to stop and set up camp before dark. I found a patch of relatively flat ground, cleared some sticks, and pitched my tent. The simple act of building shelter calmed me a little. I ate sparingly, drank filtered water from a nearby trickle of a stream, and sat in the fading light, listening. That's when I realized just how alone I was. The forest grew louder as night fell. Insects buzzed and chirped, frogs croaked, and unseen creatures rustled through the undergrowth. Every snap of a twig sent a chill through me. My headlamp cut only a narrow cone of light, and beyond that, the woods seemed endless and threatening. I tried to sleep, but every sound jolted me awake. I kept picturing animals wandering near my tent. Bears, mountain lions, even smaller things that could still be dangerous. I must have slept in short bursts, because when I finally opened my eyes for good, it was dawn. My body ached from the thin pad beneath me, and my mouth was dry. But I was alive, and the sun brought new courage. I packed quickly and decided on a plan. I would follow the stream downhill. Water usually led somewhere, and I figured eventually it might take me toward a valley or even back to civilization. It wasn't ideal, but wandering aimlessly wasn't either. The day was long and brutal. The stream twisted through gullies, thick brush, and steep inclines. Sometimes it disappeared underground, leaving me scrambling over rocks until it reappeared further down. My legs burned, and cuts from thorns stung with sweat, but I kept moving. By mid-afternoon, I noticed something unsettling. I had not seen a single sign of people. No fire rings, no trash, no footprints, nothing. It was as if I had walked into a part of the forest no one touched. That thought sank into me, heavy and frightening. I camped again that night by the stream. My food was dwindling now, and I forced myself to eat less. Sleep was worse this time. I woke to noises, something splashing in the stream, heavy steps on the ground nearby. My heart pounded, and I gripped my knife in the dark, every muscle tense. I didn't sleep much after that. The third day was worse. My legs shook with exhaustion, and blisters formed on my feet. I stumbled often, catching myself on branches. At one point, I fell hard, scraping my arm and smashing my knee against a rock. The pain made me cry out, and I sat there for a long time, clutching my leg, staring at the endless forest around me. The hopelessness pressed down, and for a moment I thought I might give up right there. But I forced myself up. I limped onward, slower now, but unwilling to stop. Hours passed, and my mind drifted in and out of panic. It was late in the afternoon, with the sun sinking low again, when I finally saw something different. A shape through the trees, straight lines, not natural. My heart leapt. I pushed through branches, stumbling into a small clearing. There, half-rotten and overgrown, was a wooden structure. Not a cabin exactly, but more like a hunting shack or storage shed. The roof sagged, the walls were warped, and the door hung crooked. But it was human, proof that I wasn't the only one who had ever been here. I staggered toward it. Inside, it smelled of rot and animals. Old, rusted tools lay scattered, and nests filled the corners. But there was a broken cot, and more importantly, there were old cans of food. Most were split or unusable, but a few seemed intact. I almost cried with relief. I stayed there that night, safer behind wooden walls than in my tent. I ate one of the cans cold, drank water, and lay on the cot. But as night stretched on, I realized something. The shack was I had been planning the hike for weeks. The idea had started when I was looking at maps of nearby trails late one evening, scrolling through satellite images and topographic lines like someone daydreaming of far-off places. I wanted a challenge, but I also wanted something remote, something that felt far from towns, roads, and phone service. I thought that being away from everything would clear my mind, give me the kind of peace I always searched for. I had been stressed, dealing with work, bills, and the usual weight of daily life. And I believed that if I went out there alone, surrounded by nothing but trees and mountains, I would find some kind of relief. The route I chose wasn't marked on the tourist brochures or local hiking websites. It was a longer back trail that looped deep into a valley, followed an old logging road for a while, then climbed up into the ridges. I had found pieces of information about it from different places online, and it looked doable if I paced myself. It was supposed to take 2 or 3 days, depending on how much ground I covered each day. I had the time, and I liked the idea of moving at my own speed, not rushing. When I packed, I tried to be smart. A sturdy backpack, a tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, extra clothes, a water filter, and enough food for 4 days just to be safe. I made sure to add a first aid kit, extra socks, and a headlamp with new batteries. I kept checking my gear list as if forgetting something small would ruin everything. I didn't tell many people I was going. I only mentioned it casually to one person a few days before, not giving much detail, because I wanted the trip to be my own quiet experience. I figured nothing would happen. People hike alone all the time. The morning I left was calm, a pale sky hanging over the horizon, the air cool and damp from rain the night before. The dirt parking area where the trail started was empty when I pulled up. The silence felt good, like I had the whole place to myself. I shouldered my pack, adjusted the straps, locked my car, and stepped into the woods. The trail was wide at first, like a rough road pressed down by old trucks. Mud puddles filled low spots, and I had to watch my steps to keep from soaking my boots too early. The trees rose on both sides, tall pines mixed with bare-barked aspens, their leaves fluttering lightly in the breeze. The smell of wet earth was strong, mixed with the sharpness of pine sap. I felt calm, my thoughts slowing to the steady rhythm of my boots crunching gravel and leaves. Hours passed in a way that was easy to lose track of. I stopped sometimes to sip water or eat a handful of trail mix. The deeper I went, the narrower the trail became, the more it seemed to close in on itself. Brush grew thicker along the edges, branches hanging low, forcing me to duck now and then. At one point, I heard the faint rush of water and followed the sound down to a creek. The water was cold and clear, rushing around rocks and fallen logs. I filled one of my bottles using my filter, crouched on the bank with the smell of wet moss strong in the air. It felt good to drink straight from the stream, knowing I could rely on it for the trip. I pushed on, climbing higher into the ridges. The trail became steeper, my breathing heavier, sweat soaking into my shirt beneath the straps of my pack. I kept telling myself I had time. I could stop whenever I needed to. My legs burned, but I welcomed it because it made me feel alive and focused. Every once in a while, I glanced back the way I had come, watching the land sink lower and lower, the world spreading out behind me. By late afternoon, I started thinking about where to camp. I wanted a flat spot, not too close to the trail but not too far either. After some searching, I found a clearing with soft ground and a few fallen logs I could sit on. I dropped my pack, stretched my sore shoulders, and pitched the tent. By the time I boiled water for a simple meal, the sun was already low, its orange light cutting through the trees. As I ate, I listened. The forest had a strange way of becoming louder as the light faded. Birds called sharply as if announcing the end of the day, insects buzzed in waves, and every so often I heard a crack of wood deeper in the trees. I told myself it was just deer or small animals moving through the brush. I finished my food, packed packed things away carefully, and crawled into my tent. That first night was harder than I expected. The ground was uneven despite my efforts to clear rocks and sticks. I shifted often, trying to find a comfortable position. Every sound outside pressed against my ears. I tried to remind myself that this was normal, that being out here alone just made everything feel louder. Still, when a sharp snap echoed not far away, I felt my heart pound. I lay there stiff, holding my breath, waiting. Nothing followed. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. The next morning was cold. I unzipped the tent to see fog drifting between the trees, curling low to the ground like smoke. My breath puffed out white as I lit the stove for coffee. My muscles ached from the climb the day before, but after moving around, the stiffness loosened. I packed up, hoisted my gear, and continued along the trail. The path climbed again, winding through rocky sections where I had to use my hands to steady myself. My boots slipped once or twice on loose gravel, sending small stones skittering down the slope. My pulse quickened, reminding me that one wrong move could end badly if I wasn't careful. I slowed my pace, double-checking each step. At midday, I stopped on a ridge to eat. The view spread out below me, layers of trees, ridges stacking one behind the other, the faint shimmer of water in the distance. I sat on a rock, chewing slowly, feeling the weight of silence around me. Out there, no hum of cars, no voices, nothing human. Just the occasional call of a bird and the faint stir of wind. The longer I sat, the more I noticed how still it was. The silence seemed heavy, almost unnatural. I realized I hadn't heard much movement from animals that day. No rustling in the undergrowth, no squirrels darting across branches. I shrugged it off, telling myself maybe it was just the hour, maybe animals stayed hidden at midday. Still, I felt a faint unease creep into my stomach. I continued on, following the trail as it narrowed even more. It wasn't marked often, just faint blazes on trees now and then. I had to pay attention to keep from losing it. At one point, the ground grew soggy, and I sank ankle-deep into mud, pulling hard to free my boot. My socks grew damp, and I cursed under my breath. I had packed extra, but I didn't like starting the second day with wet feet. The afternoon dragged. My shoulders hurt from the pack, and I grew impatient, wanting to reach another good campsite. I kept scanning the trees for a clearing, but everything seemed dense and uneven. I walked longer than I planned, pushing myself, until finally I found a spot near a fallen pine. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. That night, I felt the unease return. It was the way the forest sounded, too quiet again. I thought I heard something moving slowly in the brush once, but when I sat still, holding my breath, it faded. My mind wouldn't stop imagining things. A bear nosing through my pack, a stranger stepping into the clearing. I tried to laugh it off silently, but my nerves were tight. I slept in short bursts, waking often, staring into the dark fabric of my tent. The third day was when things began to feel wrong in a way I couldn't ignore. It started in the morning when I noticed boot prints on the trail ahead. They weren't mine. The tread was different, wider, the stride longer. They looked fresh, pressed deep into damp earth as if from the night before. At first, I felt relieved, thinking maybe someone else was out here, that I wasn't alone after all. But as I followed them, unease grew. The prints didn't seem to go in one direction. They appeared, then faded, then reappeared, sometimes slightly off the trail, sometimes circling back. It didn't look like someone hiking with a purpose. It looked like wandering. My stomach tightened as I crouched to study them. The edges were sharp, not softened by time. Whoever left them was close, too close. I kept moving, but now every sound made me whip my head around. A branch breaking in the distance made me freeze. The snap of twigs beneath my own boots sounded too loud, like I was giving myself away. I felt watched, though when I stopped to scan the trees, I saw nothing but trunks and shadows. By late afternoon, I couldn't shake the feeling. I pushed harder, wanting to put distance between myself and whoever left those prints. My legs ached, but I didn't want to stop. The thought of camping with someone unknown nearby gnawed at me. Still, as the light sank, I had no choice. I had to set camp. I chose a spot farther from the trail this time, moving through brush until I found a clearing hidden among trees. I didn't even cook a hot meal. I ate cold food quickly, then sat listening, every sense straining. That night was the worst yet. I lay in my tent, eyes wide, when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving on the trail not far away. My whole body went rigid. The steps crunched softly on leaves, pawed. I had planned the trip for weeks. It wasn't anything extreme, just a long solo hike in the mountains to clear my head. I liked going out there when life felt heavy. The trails, the smell of pine, the way the air always felt cooler and sharper when I got away from the city. I packed light but careful, enough food for 2 days, water, a small filter, a map, compass, sleeping bag, tarp, knife, and a headlamp. I checked everything twice the night before, made sure my boots were broken in, and laid out my clothes. I wanted no mistakes. I had read too many reports of people wandering off trails or not being ready for sudden changes in weather. I wanted to avoid becoming one of those stories. The trail I picked was not popular. That was on purpose. I wanted quiet. It cut through a series of ridges and valleys, ending near a small lake about 12 miles from the trailhead. Most people didn't bother with it because there were no official campsites, no signs, and parts of the path were faint. But that appealed to me. I wanted to be alone, just me and the woods. I left early in the morning, around 6, with the sun just starting to push through the trees. The air was cold, and my breath looked like smoke. The parking lot was empty, just my car sitting there under the pale light. I should have taken that as a sign, but at the time it felt like freedom. No one else around. No sounds except my boots hitting the dirt and the distant calls of birds waking up. I pulled my pack tighter and started uphill. The first miles went smooth. The trail wound through thick forest, moss growing heavy on the trees, the ground soft under a blanket of needles. I felt good, strong, legs fresh. I liked hearing the crunch of gravel when the dirt gave way, the occasional snap of twigs under my step. The forest smelled damp and alive. Every so often I stopped to sip water, letting the silence settle back in before moving forward again. After about 3 hours, the trail got steeper. I climbed a ridge, heart pounding, sweat sticking my shirt to my back. At the top, I took a break, leaning against a rock and pulling out a snack. From up there, the view stretched wide, layers of hills and valleys, a sea of trees rolling out forever. It made me feel both small and proud at the same time. I was in the middle of nowhere, and I had gotten there by my own feet. That thought gave me a strange kind of energy. I pressed on, following the trail as it narrowed. At points, the path was barely there, more like a thin line of flattened grass between tall ferns. I kept checking my map, making sure I was still on track. The trail bent down into a valley, the trees closing tighter, the light dimmer. The air grew cooler, and I noticed how quiet it was. No birds, no wind moving the branches. Just me, my footsteps, and the creak of my pack straps. That was when I first felt it. A strange tension, like I wasn't as alone as I thought. I told myself it was just the silence, that my brain was filling the gap. Still, I kept glancing behind me, expecting to see someone, but there was never anything, just empty trail. By late afternoon, I reached a clearing beside a stream. It was a good place to set up for the night. Flat ground, water close by, enough trees for shelter. I dropped my pack and let out a breath of relief. My shoulders ached and my legs were heavy, but I had made good time. I set up the tarp between 2 trees, rolled out my sleeping bag, and started a small fire using dry twigs I found nearby. The flames crackled softly, giving the clearing a warm glow. I ate slowly, watching the firelight flicker across the trees. The forest stayed quiet, too quiet. Normally by dusk, I'd hear frogs, insects, maybe an owl. But that evening, nothing. Just the stream running nearby and the occasional snap of wood in the fire. It made me uneasy. I tried to brush it off. Some places are just like that, I thought. I told myself to enjoy the peace. When I finally crawled into my bag, the cold had crept in heavy. I zipped up tight, pulling the fabric around my face, listening. I expected sleep to come easy after so many miles, but instead I lay awake, heart beating faster than it should. Every rustle outside the tarp made me tense. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps near the stream, slow, steady, then gone. I sat up, straining to hear, but it faded into nothing. I wanted to believe it was just water moving over rocks. At some point, I must have drifted off, but it was a restless sleep. I woke often, checking the darkness, gripping the knife I kept close by. When the sky finally turned gray with morning, I felt more tired than rested. I packed quickly, wanting to keep moving. The second day was harder. My legs were sore, shoulders raw from the straps. The trail grew rougher, sometimes disappearing under fallen branches or covered in ferns that whipped against my legs as I pushed through. I had to stop often to check the map and compass. The sun was bright overhead, but under the trees, the world stayed dim, almost claustrophobic. It was late morning when I saw the boot print, clear, pressed into the mud at the edge of the trail. It wasn't mine. The tread was different, wider. I crouched and studied it, tracing the edges with my eyes. It looked fresh, maybe a day old at most. My chest tightened. I had thought no one used this trail. I hadn't seen another car at the lot. Who else would be out here? I kept walking, trying to shake the thought, but soon I found another print, and another. They followed the same trail I was on. My pace slowed, ears sharp for any sound. I felt exposed, like someone might be just ahead or behind. I kept glancing around, my stomach knotting tighter with every step. By the time I reached the lake, I was drained. The water stretched calm and still, reflecting the trees that surrounded it. Normally, it would have felt rewarding to arrive, but unease gnawed at me. I kept thinking of those prints. I scanned the shore, half expecting to see someone standing there, but it was empty. I dropped my pack and drank deeply from the filter, then sat on a rock, trying to relax. But the stillness pressed on me again. No birds, no insects, no sound except the faint lap of water. I couldn't shake the thought that I was being watched. When night fell, I didn't light a fire. I thought it would make me too visible. Instead, I ate cold food and slid into my bag, heart pounding at every small noise. Somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard branches snapping, but it was impossible to tell how far away. I lay still, barely breathing, gripping the knife in my hand. Sleep came in short bursts, each one broken by some sound or by my own racing thoughts. Around midnight, I swore I heard slow movement near the trees, deliberate, careful. Not the wind, not an animal. Something pacing, then stopping. My whole body tensed, waiting, but it never came closer. Hours dragged until finally, light seeped through the trees. I packed in silence, barely eating, eager to get back. I decided to cut the trip short and head straight for the trailhead. I couldn't enjoy it anymore. Every step felt heavier, every sound sharper. I kept checking over my shoulder, sure I'd see someone behind me. Halfway back, I noticed something that froze me in place. A piece of cloth caught on a low branch. Dark, torn, dirty. I pulled it free, heart thudding. It looked like part of a shirt sleeve, frayed at the edges. It was damp, smelling faintly of sweat and earth. My mind raced. Someone had been here recently, maybe close. The rest of the hike was a blur of nerves and sweat. I pushed my body harder than I should have, barely stopping for water. The forest felt alive with eyes on me. Every snapped twig behind me made me flinch. I imagined footsteps just out of sync with mine. Someone trailing me, never close enough to see. When I finally reached the ridge that overlooked the parking lot, relief washed over me. My car was there, small and distant. I almost ran down the last stretch, lungs burning, legs trembling. But when I stepped out into the open lot, my stomach dropped. There was another car parked beside mine, old, beat up, with mud caked thick around the wheels. I hadn't seen it when I left. It hadn't been there. The windows were tinted, hard to see inside. My chest tightened as I scanned the lot, but it was empty, no one in sight. I didn't wait. I threw my pack in the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors fast. My hands shook as I turned the key and the engine roared to life. I kept checking the mirrors as I pulled out, half expecting someone to step out of the trees. But no one did. The drive back felt endless. Every time headlights appeared behind me, I thought it might be that car following. When I finally reached the edge of town, I pulled over at a gas station, heart still racing. I looked back down the road, but nothing followed. I never found out who left those prints, or whose car that was, or what moved around my camp at night. But I know I wasn't alone out there, and I know I had been planning the hike for weeks. The trail wasn't famous, but I had read about it online, and what caught my attention was how remote it seemed. It was supposed to be a long loop trail that cut through thick forest, climbed along a ridge, and then came back down to a small river crossing before meeting the gravel road where most hikers left their cars. What appealed to me was that it wasn't crowded. Most people avoided it because it wasn't well maintained, and some complained about overgrown sections. That was exactly what I wanted. I wanted quiet, solitude, and a chance to push myself on something that wasn't just a paved tourist path. I drove out early in the morning. The air was cool, and the gravel crunched under my tires as I parked by the small clearing at the trailhead. My backpack felt heavier than it should have, even though I had packed carefully. Water bottles, snacks, a headlamp, a small knife, and a first aid kit filled most of the space. I had read warnings about people underestimating the trail, so I packed extra just in case. I checked the straps, tightened them around my shoulders, and then stood in front of the weathered sign nailed to a post. The words were faded, and one corner of the board was split, but I could still make out the painted letters spelling the trail name. The first section was easy. The dirt path was wide enough for two people to walk side by side, and the morning light poured through the tall trees. Everything smelled like pine and wet soil. I walked at a steady pace, taking in the sound of birds calling overhead and the distant rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. I felt comfortable, even calm. After about an hour, the path began to narrow. The trees leaned closer, and branches scratched against my arms when I wasn't careful. I noticed how quickly the quietness deepened. The birds were still out there, but their songs were softer, more distant. The air felt cooler under the dense canopy, and the light dimmed, even though the sun was still high in the sky. The trail wound uphill. My legs began to burn as I climbed, and sweat ran down my back, soaking into the straps of my backpack. I had to stop a few times, leaning against tree trunks to catch my breath. Each time I paused, the silence pressed in. The woods had a way of making me feel watched, even though I knew it was only my imagination. Still, I found myself glancing back over my shoulder more than once, scanning the twisted roots and fallen branches for any sign of movement. As I climbed higher, the ground became rockier. The dirt path gave way to uneven stones, some loose underfoot. I had to be careful not to twist an ankle. The slope was steep, and at times the trail cut along the edge of a drop-off. When I looked down, my stomach tightened. A misstep could have sent me tumbling into the trees far below. Hours passed. The sun shifted, and the shadows grew longer. I reached the ridge by early afternoon. From there, I had a view of the forest stretching endlessly in every direction. It was beautiful but unsettling. I could see how far I was from anything else, how deep I was inside the wilderness. There were no roads, no rooftops, no sign of people anywhere. Just trees, mountains, and silence. I sat on a flat rock and pulled out a snack. The air was cooler at the ridge, and a light breeze brushed against my face. My legs ached, but I felt proud for making it this far. I checked my watch and figured I had enough time to follow the loop back down before dark. I stood up, stretched, and started along the ridge trail. The path was narrow here, hugging the side of the slope. On one side, the ground dropped steeply into thick forest. On the other, jagged rock walls rose upward. It was the kind of place where passing another hiker would have been nearly impossible. The dirt was loose, and some sections looked unstable. I walked carefully, planting each step firmly before shifting my weight. It was somewhere along this ridge that I began to feel uneasy. It wasn't a single sound or sight. It was a slow creeping awareness that something had changed. The breeze had died, and the woods were strangely still. My own footsteps sounded louder than they should have, echoing faintly off the rock wall. I felt exposed, as if someone or something could be watching me from the trees below. I shook it off and kept walking, but the feeling didn't leave. My senses sharpened, every noise amplified. When a branch cracked in the distance, my heart jumped. I froze, listening, but nothing followed. Just silence. I forced myself to keep moving, telling myself it was probably just an animal. The further I went, the rougher the trail became. Sections of the path had eroded, leaving narrow strips of dirt clinging to the edge. I moved slowly, pressing my hand against the rock wall when I could. In one spot, I slipped slightly, my boot skidding on loose gravel, and I had to drop to one knee to steady myself. My pulse raced, and for a moment, I pictured myself sliding down the slope, crashing through the trees, and lying broken at the bottom where no one would find me. I stayed crouched until my breathing slowed, then pushed myself back up. By the time I reached the end of the ridge trail, the light was beginning to fade. The sun was lowering, staining the tops of the trees with orange. I still had to make it down the other side and across the river before I reached the gravel road. I picked up my pace, but I was careful not to move too fast. The descent was worse than the climb. The path was steep and uneven, covered in loose rocks. My knees began to ache from the pressure, and my legs trembled with each step. I slipped more than once, catching myself on tree trunks to avoid falling. The deeper I went, the darker it became. The trees thickened again, blocking the light. I pulled out my headlamp as the forest dimmed. The beam of light cut through the shadows, but it also made me feel trapped inside a narrow tunnel of visibility. Everything outside the circle of light seemed hidden and alive. My imagination ran wild. I thought I saw shapes moving between the trees, but when I turned my head, there was nothing, just darkness and silence. The sound of rushing water eventually reached me. Relief washed over me when I realized I was nearing the river crossing. The path leveled out, and the ground became softer with damp soil. The air smelled fresher, cooler. When I reached the river, my relief faded. The water was higher than I expected, swollen from recent rain. The stones that were supposed to form a crossing were half submerged, slick with moss. The current was fast, carrying broken branches and foam downstream. I stood at the edge, shining my headlamp across the water. The far bank seemed farther away than it should have been. My legs ached, my body was tired, and the thought of crossing made my stomach twist. Still, I didn't have much of a choice. The loop didn't have another exit. I tested the first stone with my boot. It was slippery, but it held. I stepped onto it, then the next. The water roared around me, and the spray dampened my legs. Halfway across, I hesitated. One stone shifted slightly under my weight, and I nearly lost my balance. My arms flailed as I fought to steady myself. My heart pounded in my ears. I crouched low, moving slowly until I reached the far bank. I collapsed onto the damp soil, breathing hard. My clothes were damp, my boots soaked, but I was across. I sat for a few minutes, regaining my strength. The forest around me was darker now, the night closing in. I knew I had to keep moving if I wanted to reach my car. The final stretch was supposed to be easy, just a flat path leading back to the gravel road. But in the dark, it was anything but easy. The trail was hard to follow, overgrown in places. My headlamp lit only a narrow section at a time, and every branch that brushed against me made me flinch. My nerves were frayed, every sound magnified. At one point, I heard movement behind me. Heavy, deliberate steps, not the quick scurry of an animal. I froze, holding my breath, my ears straining. The sound stopped when I stopped. My chest tightened, and I forced myself not to turn around. I walked faster, my steps quick and uneven, the beam of my light shaking across the trail. The noise came again, closer this time. Footsteps. I was sure of it. My mouth went dry, and my heart hammered against my ribs. I didn't run. I was too afraid of tripping in the dark, but I moved as quickly as I could. The footsteps followed, always just behind me, always stopping when I stopped. By the time I saw the faint glimmer of the gravel road ahead, I was nearly sprinting. My legs burned, my lungs ached, but I didn't care. I burst out of the trees into the open clearing, my light bouncing wildly. My car sat where I had left it, a dark shape against the pale gravel. I didn't look back. I fumbled with my keys, hands shaking, and yanked the door open. I climbed inside, slammed the lock down, and sat in the driver's seat, gasping for air. My headlamp illuminated the trees at the trail's edge, but nothing stepped out. The woods stood silent and still. I started the engine and pulled away, gravel spraying. I have always liked hiking, not in a professional way, but enough to spend weekends exploring trails outside of town. I never went looking for adventure or danger. I just liked being out there, away from cars, traffic, noise, and all the little problems that hang on me during the week. Hiking felt simple. Step after step, the sound of my own breathing, the crunch of dirt and leaves, the smell of pine or wet earth after rain, felt real. I never thought something so simple could turn into the scariest experience of my life, but one hike showed me how quickly things can go wrong. It happened 2 years ago, early fall. The air was cool but not cold, and the leaves had just started to change color. I decided to hike a trail in a state forest about 3 hours from where I lived. I had been there once before, but only on one of the shorter trails. That day, I wanted to try a longer one that looped deep into the forest and climbed up toward a ridge. I had read that the view at the top was worth it, especially with the fall colors spreading out below. I started the morning with a heavy breakfast, packed up some food, extra water, and a small first aid kit. I made sure I had my headlamp in case I came back late, though I wasn't planning on being out after dark. I wore layers, long-sleeve shirt, light jacket, hiking boots that were already broken in. Everything felt fine when I set out. The first part of the hike was easy. The trail was wide, the ground dry, and I passed a few other hikers heading out or back. The forest was open enough that sunlight came through in patches. I felt relaxed, moving at a steady pace, listening to the crunch of my boots. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp leaves. My backpack felt heavy but manageable. After about 2 miles, the trail narrowed. The trees closed in tighter, blocking more light. I didn't see any more hikers after that. I remember how quiet it felt, like the forest swallowed sound. My breathing seemed louder, and every snap of a twig underfoot echoed in my ears. I tried not to think about how far from the trailhead I was. I followed the markers nailed to trees, red paint circles that showed the route. They looked fresh, so I didn't worry about getting lost. The ground started sloping upward, rocky in some spots, and I slowed my pace. I stopped a few times to drink water and adjust my pack. The forest floor was scattered with fallen branches, and some areas looked like they hadn't been walked on in weeks. About 4 miles in, I noticed the trail got harder to follow. The red circles were farther apart, and sometimes I had to stop, scan the trees, and backtrack a few steps before spotting the next one. It made me uneasy, but I kept going. I told myself the markers would keep showing up, and I had my GPS on my phone if needed. The air grew cooler as I climbed higher, and the light shifted. It was still daytime, but the thick canopy made it dim, like late afternoon. I kept moving until the path leveled out at a ridge. The trees thinned, and I could finally see the view. I stood there for a long time, catching my breath, looking out over miles of rolling hills. The forest stretched in every direction, a blanket of green and orange and yellow. It was beautiful, the kind of view that makes all the effort worth it. I ate some food, drank water, and rested. After maybe 20 minutes, I decided to head back down. That's when things started going wrong. I walked back the way I came, but when I reached a fork in the trail, I realized I couldn't remember which way I had come from. Both directions looked the same, narrow dirt paths between dense trees. I checked for markers, but I didn't see any right away. My chest tightened a little. I picked the left path, thinking it felt more familiar. I walked for 15 minutes before realizing there hadn't been a single red circle. The trail itself started fading, narrowing until it barely looked like a path. My stomach dropped. I turned back quickly, retracing my steps. By the time I got back to the fork, sweat was running down my back even though the air was cool. I tried the other path. At first it looked right, and I saw a faded red circle on a tree that reassured me. I kept going, forcing myself to stay calm. But after another half mile, the trail dipped into a swampy patch I didn't remember crossing before. My boots sank into wet soil, and I cursed under my breath. I knew then I was on the wrong path again. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS. At first it worked, showing the trail lines and my location. But then the signal cut out. The little blue dot froze, then disappeared. I turned in a circle, holding the phone up like that would help. Nothing. No bars. Just a blank map. Panic started creeping in. I told myself to breathe, to think. I still had daylight. I had food, water, and a headlamp. I wasn't completely lost, just off trail. If I kept moving in one direction, I'd eventually hit a road or another trail. That's what I told myself. I decided to keep walking. I tried to pay attention to the sun to keep my sense of direction, but under the trees it was hard to tell. The forest seemed endless, the same trees repeating over and over. My legs ached, and my pack felt heavier with every step. After another hour, I realized I hadn't seen any signs of people. No markers, no footprints, no cut logs, just raw forest. The quiet grew heavier, pressing in on me. Every crack of a branch made me jump. I started noticing movement in the trees, squirrels, maybe deer, but each sound made me freeze, heart racing. I took a break, sitting on a fallen log. I drank water, forced myself to eat a protein bar even though I wasn't hungry. My mind kept running in circles. What if I wandered deeper in? What if it got dark before I found the trail? What if no one came this way for days? I pushed myself up and kept walking. The ground got rougher, uneven, and I stumbled a few times. My boots slipped on loose rocks, and at one point I fell hard on my side. The shock rattled me, and for a second I just lay there, staring up at the sky through the leaves. I forced myself up, brushing dirt off, wincing at a sore hip. The forest was darker now. I knew sunset was coming. I tried to move faster, but the ground slowed me down. Branches scratched my arms, and my boots snagged on roots. The air felt colder, and I could see my breath when I stopped. Finally, when the light was almost gone, I saw something that froze me in place. About 20 yards ahead, tucked between trees, was an old, weathered cabin. It looked abandoned. The wood was gray and warped, the roof sagging in the middle. One shutter hung loose, banging softly in the breeze. Grass and weeds grew high around it. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or more afraid. On one hand, it was shelter. On the other, I had no idea who it belonged to or if anyone still used it. But darkness was closing in fast, and I didn't have many choices. I approached slowly, every step feeling heavier. The cabin smelled faintly of rot, like damp wood left too long in the rain. The door was shut, but when I pushed it, it creaked open. The sound made my skin prickle. Inside, it was dim, but enough light filtered through gaps in the walls to see. The floor was covered in dirt and leaves. A broken chair sat in the corner. The air was stale, like no one had been inside for years. I set my pack down and pulled out my headlamp. The beam cut across the room, showing empty shelves and cobwebs. No sign of recent use. That made me feel a little better. I decided to stay there for the night. I cleared a corner, spread my jacket on the floor, and sat with my back against the wall. My stomach growled, so I ate another bar, sipped water, and tried to settle my breathing. The forest outside grew silent as night fell. I could hear wind through the trees, distant cracks and rustles, but nothing close. Still, every sound made my nerves twitch. I sat there for hours, my headlamp dimming, fighting off sleep. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke with a start to a noise outside. It was faint, like footsteps crunching leaves. My chest tightened instantly. I held my breath, listening. The sound came again, slow, deliberate. Not an animal moving quick or clumsy. Something heavier. I froze, heart pounding, ears straining. The steps circled the cabin, then stopped. Silence. I sat there in the dark, afraid to move, every muscle tense. Minutes dragged like hours. Then I heard the steps again, moving away, fading into the forest. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat with my headlamp off, clutching a stick I found in the corner, staring at the door. When morning came, pale light leaking through the cracks, I didn't waste time. I packed up, stepped outside, and started walking. My legs felt stiff, my eyes heavy from no sleep, but I forced myself forward, following the slope downhill, hoping it would lead to a road or stream. After hours of pushing through thick brush, I finally stumbled onto a dirt road. Relief crashed over me so hard I almost cried. I followed the road for what felt I never thought a simple hiking trip would turn into the most terrifying experience of my life. Looking back now, I realize how close I came to not making it back at all. It started as a plan for a long solo hike, something I often did to clear my head. I liked being away from the noise of the city and losing myself in the quiet of the woods and mountains. But this trip went wrong in so many ways that I still feel uneasy every time I think about it. I chose a trail that I had never been on before. It was located in a national forest a few hours from my home. I had read about it online and checked the maps. It looked challenging but not impossible. The trail was about 12 miles long and climbed through heavy forest, rocky ridges, and narrow paths that followed along the side of steep drop-offs. I packed light but made sure I had the basics: water, some energy bars, a small first aid kit, and my phone. The plan was to start in the morning, take my time, and finish the hike before sunset. The weather was clear when I set out. The sky was bright blue with only a few thin clouds, and the air was cool. The trailhead was empty except for one other car parked to the side. I strapped on my pack and started walking, feeling excited and confident. The first few miles were simple. The trail wound through thick forest, where the sunlight came down in narrow beams between tall trees. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the air smelled like pine and damp earth. After about an hour, the trail started climbing. The trees became thinner, and the ground turned rocky. I could see further now, out across the valleys and hills. The view was amazing, and I stopped a few times just to look out at the distance. I took sips of water and kept moving, making good time. Everything felt calm, and I didn't have a single thought that anything bad could happen. But as the trail got steeper, I noticed it wasn't as well marked as I had expected. The painted blazes on the trees were faded, and some areas didn't have any at all. I had to keep checking the ground for signs of footsteps or worn dirt to make sure I was going the right way. It slowed me down. I kept thinking about the map I had checked earlier, trying to remember where the sharp turns and forks were. By early afternoon, clouds had started rolling in. They weren't heavy storm clouds, just thick gray ones that blocked the sun. It made the forest look darker. The wind picked up too, and I could hear it moving through the trees. I reached a part of the trail where it ran along a steep ridge. On one side, the land sloped upward with loose rocks and shrubs. On the other side, it dropped almost straight down into a deep valley. The path was barely wide enough for me to walk comfortably, and I had to place each step carefully. The wind blew harder there, and I had to keep my arms out slightly for balance. I felt nervous for the first time. The ground was uneven, and little pieces of gravel slid down when I stepped on them. I moved slowly, knowing that one wrong step could send me down the side. My legs felt tight, and my chest was heavy. I kept telling myself to just focus on one step at a time. After what felt like forever, the ridge section ended, and the trail dropped back into the trees. I let out a long breath of relief and stopped to rest. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking. I sat on a rock, drank some water, and ate half a granola bar. I didn't want to stop too long because I knew I still had miles left, but I needed a moment to calm down. When I started again, I realized I hadn't seen any trail markers in a while. The path looked like it split in two directions, and I wasn't sure which one to take. Both looked like they had been walked on, but one sloped downward while the other went uphill. I tried to remember the map in my head, but I couldn't be sure. I decided to take the uphill path, thinking it was more likely to stay on the ridgeline. That was the mistake that set everything in motion. The trail grew fainter as I went. The ground was covered in leaves, and I couldn't tell if anyone had used it recently. After about 15 minutes, I realized I might not be on the real trail anymore. I stopped and looked around, but I couldn't see any blazes or signs. I thought about turning back, but the ground behind me looked just as confusing. The more I looked, the more everything blended together. The trees all looked the same, and the air was silent except for the wind. I pulled out my phone to check the GPS, but there was no service. The blue dot showed me in the middle of nothing, and the map wasn't loading. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I turned around and started back the way I thought I had come, trying to find where the split had been. But the forest seemed different now. The path wasn't clear anymore, and I kept second-guessing each turn. After another half hour, I realized I was lost, completely lost. I tried not to panic. I told myself I had plenty of daylight left, plenty of water, and some food. If I kept moving, I would eventually find the main trail again. I just needed to stay calm. But the more I walked, the less certain I felt. The ground was uneven and sloped in directions that didn't feel right. I tripped over roots and slipped on wet leaves. My ankles hurt from trying to keep balance, and sweat was dripping down my back even though the air was cool. The forest started to feel oppressive. The trees were closer together, and the wind sounded louder as it rushed through the branches. I could hear small noises, snaps of twigs, rustles in the underbrush, that made me whip my head around. I didn't see anything, but the sounds made me move faster. I knew animals lived out here, and even though most would avoid me, the thought of running into something larger made my chest tight. By late afternoon, the clouds had thickened, and the light was fading fast. My heart sank when I realized I might not make it back before dark. I picked up my pace, pushing through shrubs and climbing over rocks. I tried to move in what I thought was a straight line, but the forest twisted me around. Every ridge I climbed looked the same. Every hollow I crossed felt like the last. Then I reached another ridge, even narrower than the first one. The drop on either side was worse this time, steep cliffs covered in jagged rocks. The wind had grown stronger too, howling across the open space. My throat felt dry as I stepped onto it. The path was barely more than a line of dirt along the ridge top. Each step made small rocks tumble down the sides, bouncing into the valley below. Halfway across, the ground shifted under me. My foot slid, and I dropped to my knees, grabbing at the dirt with my hands. Pebbles rolled away, and I felt my stomach drop as I looked at the sheer drop beside me. My pack almost pulled me sideways, and I had to twist hard to keep from sliding down. My heart pounded so hard it made my ears ring. I stayed frozen there for several minutes, breathing fast, afraid to move. Finally, I forced myself to crawl forward on my hands and knees until the path widened again. My pants were ripped at the knees, and my hands were raw from gripping the rocks, but I was alive. I sat there shaking, staring at the valley below, knowing how close I had come to falling. By then, the light was almost gone. The forest looked darker than ever, and I still had no idea where I was. My legs ached, and my water bottle was nearly empty. I kept moving, desperate to find anything. A sign, a marker, even a faint trail. My phone battery was dropping too, and I knew once it died I wouldn't even have the dim light from the screen. When true darkness came, the forest changed completely. The trees turned into black walls, and I could only see a few feet in front of me. The wind was colder, and the sounds seemed louder. I stumbled over rocks and roots, catching myself with my hands, my palms stinging each time. My breathing grew harsh, and I felt like the darkness was pressing against me from all sides. I didn't want to stop, but I had no choice. I found a small flat area under some trees and sat down, leaning against the trunk. My body ached all over, and my throat was dry. I ate another piece of granola even though I wasn't hungry, just to keep my energy up. I pulled my jacket tighter and tried to stay calm. The night felt endless. Every sound made me jolt awake when I tried to close my eyes. I could hear rustling, snapping, even the distant call of something that echoed through the valley. My mind kept imagining shapes moving in the darkness. I hugged my pack to my chest and waited, shivering, for morning. When light finally started to seep into the trees, I felt exhausted. My eyes were burning from lack of sleep, and my body was stiff. I forced myself up, drank the last of my water, and started moving again. I followed the slope of the land downhill, thinking it might lead me to a stream or a road. My lips were dry, and my stomach cramped from hunger. After hours of walking, I finally heard the sound of running water. Relief washed over me, and I pushed through the trees until I found a narrow stream trickling over rocks. I dropped to my knees and cupped the water in my hands, drinking until my stomach hurt. It was cold and clear, and it gave me enough strength to keep going. I followed the stream, hoping it would lead me somewhere. It took most of the day, but eventually, I saw I had planned this hike for weeks. It wasn't anything extreme, not like some of those multi-day trips you read about. Just a long day hike out and back. I wanted the peace of the forest, the steady rhythm of moving through miles of trees and rock, the kind of trip where you return home tired but satisfied. I had checked the weather. It was clear, cool, and calm. Early autumn, the kind of season when the air feels sharp in your lungs but not cold enough to sting. The map I had studied showed a long trail leading up to a ridge and looping around before dropping back toward the trailhead. On paper, it looked manageable. I woke before sunrise and drove out to the trailhead. The parking lot was empty when I arrived, which was what I preferred. I didn't want crowds. I wanted to be alone with the woods, with nothing but the sound of boots on dirt and leaves. I parked, packed my bag carefully, and set out just as the sun broke the horizon. The first section of the trail was wide and flat, almost easy. Fallen leaves covered the ground in a red and yellow carpet. The air was damp, carrying the smell of wet earth. Every step felt solid. My pack was heavy but balanced, filled with food, water, an extra layer, and a headlamp just in case I was slower than planned. I wasn't worried. As the trail climbed, the air grew thinner, cooler. The trees closed in. Birds flickered overhead. Squirrels rustled in the underbrush. It was peaceful in that way only the forest can be, quiet but alive. I fell into a steady pace. My breathing matched my stride. Hours passed without much change, except for the trail narrowing and the slope becoming steeper. I drank water, checked the map, and pushed on. By midday, I had reached the ridge. The view spread wide. Rolling forest below, a river glinting in the distance, hills stretching farther than I could see. I stopped to eat. I sat on a flat rock, pulled out a sandwich, and watched the breeze ripple across the trees like waves. It was exactly the kind of moment I had come for. After resting, I packed up and started down the loop section of the trail. The descent was sharper than I expected. The trail wasn't as well maintained. Roots clawed across the dirt. Rocks jutted at odd angles. My boots gripped, but I had to watch every step. I moved slower, careful not to twist an ankle. The forest felt thicker here, darker. The sun was still high, but the trees were so dense it felt later than it was. The first sign of trouble came when I reached a fork that wasn't on the map. The trail split in two, each path narrow, overgrown, almost hidden by brush. The wooden trail marker that should have stood at the junction was broken, lying half-buried in the leaves. I pulled out my paper map and compass. I thought I could match the slope of the land to the lines on the map, but the terrain didn't seem to match exactly. I chose the left trail, thinking it felt more like the loop shown on the map. At first it seemed fine. The trail wound downhill, bending through tall pines. But after half an hour, I realized it was getting less and less distinct. The dirt track thinned until it was just a faint line in the leaves. Branches reached in from both sides, clawing at my sleeves. I paused, checked the compass, and tried to reassure myself. The map suggested the loop would eventually bend back toward the ridge. Maybe this was just a rougher section. I kept going. Another 20 minutes passed, and the trail dissolved completely. I stood still, breathing hard, staring at the ground. The faint line had vanished into nothing. Around me, the forest was endless, every direction looking the same. My chest tightened. I dropped my pack and unfolded the map again. No matter how I turned it, I couldn't make sense of where I was. I decided to turn back. That was the sensible thing. I would retrace my steps to the fork and try the other path. I marked the spot with a broken branch before turning around. But the trail I thought I had followed was gone. I took a dozen steps and realized I was guessing. The ground was covered in the same carpet of leaves, scattered and shifting. What had looked like a path going downhill now looked like nothing at all. I tried to retrace by memory, but after a few minutes, every tree seemed familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. I felt heat rise in my face even though the air was cool. My pulse quickened. I forced myself to calm down. I took out the compass again and decided to head north. According to the map, north would eventually lead me back toward the ridge. If I could regain higher ground, I could reorient myself. I started walking, making sure to move in as straight a line as possible. I broke branches behind me, left marks on tree trunks with a small knife, anything to keep track of my route. Hours passed. The forest thickened. Fallen logs blocked my way. I had to climb over or circle around them, always trying to keep north, though every detour made me doubt my direction. I checked the compass constantly. The light began to fade, shadows stretching long. The air grew colder. My legs ached, and my shoulders burned under the weight of the pack. When the sun slipped behind the ridge, panic pressed harder. I hadn't made it out. I hadn't even found a recognizable trail. I had planned for a long day, but not for a night in the woods. I knew enough to stop moving once darkness fell. Moving blindly would only mean injury. I found a small clearing, just enough space to sit, and set down my pack. I gathered what little dry wood I could find and tried to light a fire. The dampness of the forest made it slow going, but eventually the flames caught. The small fire threw weak light against the trees. I sat close, knees drawn to my chest, listening to every sound. The forest that had felt peaceful during the day now felt alive in a different way. Snaps of branches, rustle of unseen animals, the low groan of trees shifting in the wind. Sleep came in fragments. I dozed, woke at every noise, stared into the flames until my eyes blurred. The night stretched on, endless. When dawn finally bled into the trees, relief washed over me. I was exhausted but alive. I packed up and started north again, moving as straight as possible. The forest seemed endless. By midday, hunger gnawed at me, though I still had food left. Water was worse. My bottles were running low, and I hadn't come across a stream. My lips cracked. My mouth felt dry and thick. The ground sloped upward, which gave me hope. Higher ground might mean a better view. I climbed until I reached a rise. From the top, I could see above the trees in some directions. What I saw made my stomach sink. Nothing but forest in every direction. No sign of the ridge. No river glinting. No trail. I pushed on. My legs trembled with each step. My feet were blistered. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in, gray and heavy. The light dimmed early. Rain began to fall, light at first, then steady. It soaked through my clothes, chilled my skin. The forest floor turned slick. I stumbled, caught myself, stumbled again. My firewood from the night before was useless now, soaked through. When darkness fell, I huddled beneath a large tree, pulled my jacket tight, and tried to stay warm. The rain didn't stop. Water dripped down my collar, ran along my back. I shivered until my teeth chattered. The second night was worse than the first. I barely slept. Every sound was sharper, closer. Once I heard heavy movement in the brush, something larger than a deer. I gripped the handle of my small knife, though I knew it wouldn't do much. My heart pounded until the sound faded. Morning came gray and wet. My body ached from shivering. My stomach cramped with hunger. I forced myself to eat half of what food I had left. My water was nearly gone. I knew I needed to find a stream. I moved downhill, reasoning that water always collects at lower points. I stumbled through brush, slid on wet leaves, tore my hands on thorns. Finally, I heard it, the faint trickle of running water. I pushed through the trees and found a narrow stream cutting through the forest. Relief hit so hard I nearly cried. I filled my bottles, drank deeply, and let the cold water wash over my face. I followed the stream, hoping it might lead to a river, maybe even a road or settlement. The banks were uneven, forcing me to climb over rocks and push through thick brush. The sound of the water was constant, pulling me forward. Hours passed. My legs shook with exhaustion, but I kept moving. By late afternoon, the stream widened slightly, and I saw something ahead, a faint shape rising above the trees. At first I thought it was another ridge, but as I got closer I realized it was man-made. A power line tower, its metal frame cutting against the sky. Relief surged. Power lines meant people. If I could reach them, I could follow them to a road. I scrambled uphill toward the tower, slipping on mud, tearing my clothes on branches, until I reached the clearing beneath it. The clearing stretched wide, a cut through the forest where the power lines ran. I stood there, soaked, shivering, staring. I always liked hiking because it gave me a sense of freedom that I couldn't find anywhere else. I liked being away from roads, houses, and all the noise of people. Out there in the woods or in the mountains, I felt small in a good way, like I was just another part of the landscape. That was why, when I had a few days off, I decided to take a long solo hike up in the mountains. I thought it would be good to push myself a little further than usual, to test my endurance and spend a night or two out in the wild without anyone around. I had no idea how quickly things could spiral out of control, or how close I would come to real danger. I picked a trail that I found on a map, one that climbed steadily up the side of a ridge before looping around into some deeper backcountry. It wasn't the most popular trail, which I liked. I thought it would mean fewer people, more quiet, more chance to be with my own thoughts. I packed what I thought was enough gear. A decent backpack, food for a couple of days, plenty of water, a filter, a map, compass, a small tent, sleeping bag, warm clothes, and a headlamp with spare batteries. Everything seemed fine when I started. The weather was mild, cool in the shade, warm in the sun. The trail started off easy, weaving through tall pines with the smell of dry needles underfoot. The ground was firm, the air was still, and every so often I would hear the sound of a bird far away or the faint rustle of something moving in the underbrush. I felt good. My legs were fresh, my backpack sat right against my back, and I told myself this was exactly what I needed after weeks of routine. As the day went on, the trail grew steeper. The trees thinned out, and the sun beat down harder. I sweated, but I didn't mind. That was part of the deal. I stopped once or twice to drink and eat a little trail mix. The view kept opening up as I gained elevation. From some of the switchbacks, I could see far down the valley, a river glinting in the light and small patches of farmland spread out below. By late afternoon, I had climbed a long way. I looked at the map and figured I would set up camp a little further ahead where the trail leveled out near a meadow. I thought it would be a good flat spot to pitch my tent. I wanted to make sure I stopped with enough daylight left, since setting up in the dark always made things harder. I reached the meadow not long after. It was quiet, surrounded by trees on three sides and open to the slope above. I set my pack down, stretched, and started unpacking my tent. The ground was soft enough for the stakes, and I had the shelter up in minutes. I laid out my sleeping bag, propped my boots near the flap, and heated a simple meal on my small stove. When the food was ready, I ate while watching the light fade. It was peaceful in that way I always wanted on trips like this. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound. At first I thought it was just wind in the trees, but it was sharper, heavier. Something moving. I lay still, listening. The noise came again, like weight on dry leaves. My chest tightened. I knew animals moved around at night, but being alone, hearing it right outside, made me uneasy. I reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on, just kept my hand on it. After a long time, the sound faded. I eventually fell back asleep, but it wasn't a deep rest. When morning came, I felt a little tired but otherwise fine. I packed up and kept going. The trail climbed again, narrower now and less maintained. Sections were overgrown, branches scraping against my sleeves. I followed the marks on the trees and the faint line of dirt. The map said this stretch would connect with another trail higher up, forming the loop I wanted. Hours passed. My legs ached from the climb. The sun was high, hot on my neck. I checked my water and decided I needed to refill soon. A stream was marked on the map not too far ahead, so I kept going. But when I reached where it should have been, the ground was dry. Only rocks and a shallow ditch remained. I crouched and touched it, hoping for dampness, but it was bone dry. I frowned and pulled the map again. Maybe I misread, maybe I needed to go a little further. I walked longer than I expected, scanning for water. My throat grew drier. At last I found a small pool under some rocks, murky but enough to use. I filtered it carefully, filled my bottle and took a long drink. Relief spread through me, but I also felt uneasy. If that stream was dry, what about the others? Would I be able to rely on the map? The trail became harder to follow. It broke into faint paths, some split by fallen trees. I paused often, trying to match what I saw with what was on the paper. Each time I thought I had it right, but doubts crept in. The sun began dipping lower again, and I knew I needed to decide. I pushed forward, telling myself it would connect soon. But then, as I stepped into a thick stand of trees, I realized the path had vanished completely. I turned, went back a few steps, searched for the faint line of dirt, but I couldn't find it. Everything looked the same: pine needles, brush, scattered rocks. My chest tightened again, stronger than before. I told myself not to panic, but my heartbeat was fast. I took out the compass, checked the direction I had been heading, and tried to line it with the map. I figured if I kept going north, I would eventually hit the higher trail. It made sense, so I started walking again, but without the clear line of a trail, it was slower. Every few minutes I had to step over deadfall or squeeze through brush. The silence pressed on me. The day stretched thin, light fading into evening. I still hadn't found the trail. My legs ached badly, my throat was dry again, and my nerves were shot. I finally decided I had to stop and camp before it got too dark to see. I found a small clearing and set up my tent quickly. The ground was uneven, but it was the best I could do. I ate a small dinner, though I wasn't hungry. My stomach knotted with worry. That night was worse. The forest felt alive in a different way, every sound sharper, every shadow heavier. I lay in my bag listening to the endless small noises, rustles, cracks, faint scrapes. My mind kept picturing animals, or worse, that I had wandered far out of range of anyone. Sleep came only in short bursts. Morning brought no comfort. I packed slowly, trying to think. I studied the map again, but nothing matched what I remembered. I chose to keep heading north, hoping to cross the bigger trail or at least reach the ridgeline where I could see more. I walked for hours, climbing steep slopes, sliding down loose dirt, pushing through branches that scraped my arms raw. Sweat stung my eyes. My bottle grew light. When I finally reached a higher spot, I looked out expecting to see a clear landmark. Instead, all I saw were endless ridges and trees, rolling on and on. No sign of a trail, no sign of a road, no sign of people. Just wild land stretching farther than I wanted to believe. My chest felt hollow. The days blurred together after that. Each day I walked. Each day I searched for water. Each night I made a rough camp, trying to rest. My food shrank to crumbs. My legs grew weaker. My lips cracked from thirst. My sense of direction wavered. Sometimes I thought I heard distant sounds. Maybe water, maybe wind, but when I followed, they led nowhere. At one point, I stumbled on an old fire ring, stones blackened with ash. My heart leapt. It meant someone had been there once. I searched all around, hoping for a trail, but it was old, maybe years old. The forest had swallowed everything else. By the fourth day, my mind was dull with exhaustion. I forced myself to keep moving, to keep some rhythm, but every step hurt. My ankles twisted on loose rocks. My shoulders burned under the pack. I felt myself slipping into something close to despair. But then, in the late afternoon, I heard a sound unlike the forest, faint but steady. A low hum. I froze, listening. I turned my head, And it came again, a distant droning. I realized it was a highway. My chest surged with hope. I dropped to my knees for a moment, overwhelmed. Then I picked up the pack and followed the sound, stumbling down a slope, crashing through brush. Took hours, longer than I thought, but the hum grew louder. At last, through the trees, I saw the gray line of asphalt. Relief hit me so hard I nearly cried. I stepped out onto the shoulder, my legs shaking, my throat raw. Cars flew past, drivers not even looking. I waved weakly, but no one slowed. Finally, after what felt like forever, one vehicle pulled over. I made it out. Later, when I looked back, I realized how easily it could have ended differently. If I hadn't heard the road, if I had gone the wrong way, if I had run out of water sooner, I might not have come back at all. The woods that I once loved had nearly taken me. I learned that no matter how much you prepare, nature doesn't bend to you. It just waits, silent and endless, until you find your way or you don't. I had been planning this hike for a while. It wasn't anything extreme like climbing mountains or crossing deserts, but it was a solo trip through a long, forested trail that stretched for several miles before reaching a ridge that overlooked the valley. I had seen photos online of people standing on that ridge, the view stretching out below them, wide and endless, and I wanted to experience it for myself. I thought I was prepared. I had done smaller hikes before, nothing more than a few miles here and there, but I was confident. I had packed a large backpack with water bottles, protein bars, jerky, a small first aid kit, an emergency blanket, a flashlight, a lighter, and a small camping knife. I also carried a paper map in case my phone lost service, though I kept telling myself that with GPS I'd be fine. I wore hiking boots that I had broken in months earlier and carried a light jacket tied around my waist. The trailhead started in a small parking area just outside the forest line. When I arrived that morning, there were only 2 other cars parked there. The air was cool, the ground still damp from dew, and the sky clear. Felt like a good day for a hike. I locked my car, adjusted the straps on my backpack, and started walking. The first part of the trail was easy. It was wide, with gravel laid down, and it curved gently upward. The forest closed in quickly, tall trees on either side, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. Birds chirped from high branches, and every so often I heard something small scurry across the underbrush. It was peaceful, quiet in a way that felt very different from the constant hum of the city I lived in. As I moved deeper, the trail narrowed. The gravel gave way to packed dirt and roots. It wasn't difficult to follow, though. The path was clear, and there were markers nailed to trees at intervals, small flashes of colored paint to keep hikers from straying too far. I walked steadily, keeping a pace that was fast enough to cover distance, but not so fast that I would tire myself out too early. For the first hour, everything was fine. I drank some water, ate half a protein bar, and continued upward. I noticed how quickly the forest seemed to swallow sound. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, until the only things I could hear were the crunch of my boots on the dirt and the occasional call of a bird. Then the trail began to change. The incline grew steeper. Roots and rocks jutted out, forcing me to watch my step carefully. The trees grew closer together, darker, and the sunlight filtering through was dim. The air felt heavier, cooler, and every so often I caught the sound of something moving in the distance. A branch snapping, leaves rustling. Each time I stopped, held my breath, and listened, but the sound would fade, leaving me unsure if it had been an animal or just the forest shifting. I kept moving. The trail twisted and climbed higher, and soon I was sweating despite the cool air. My legs burned with the effort, but I told myself it would be worth it when I reached the ridge. I imagined standing there, looking out over the valley, the wind brushing against my face, and it pushed me forward. Around midday, I stopped to rest. I found a flat rock near the trail, dropped my backpack, and sat down. I ate some jerky and drank more water. I checked my phone, no service. That didn't surprise me. I had expected it. That was why I brought the map. I pulled it out, spread it across my lap, and traced the trail with my finger. I had covered maybe half the distance. If I kept my pace, I could reach the ridge by late afternoon, spend a little time there, and then head back before dark. That was the plan. But plans rarely hold up once the unexpected happens. When I started again, I noticed the trail had grown narrower. The markers were still there, but farther apart, and at times I had to stop and search for the next one before I could continue. The incline became sharper, the ground uneven, and I had to use my hands a few times to steady myself as I climbed. Then I reached a fork. It wasn't marked on my map. The trail split into two directions. One path curved upward sharply, the other seemed to level out. Both looked worn, like they had been used many times. I stood there for a while, looking at each, pulling out the map and trying to match the lines to what I saw in front of me. But the map didn't show this fork. It just displayed one trail leading to the ridge. I should have turned back right then. I should have admitted that I wasn't sure where I was and gone back to the last marker to retrace my steps. But I didn't. I convinced myself that both paths probably led to the same place, that maybe one was just a shortcut or an older section of trail that still connected farther up. I chose the path that leveled out, telling myself it would be easier than climbing straight up. That was my first mistake. The trail at first seemed fine. It was narrow, yes, but clear enough. It wound through dense trees, twisting and turning, but I felt like I was making progress. After another half hour, though, it began to change. The dirt grew loose, patches of mud clung to my boots, and the trees crowded so close that branches scraped across my arms. The air grew cooler, damp, and I realized I hadn't seen a trail marker in a long time. A tightness formed in my chest. I tried to shake it off. I told myself that I had chosen correctly, that the ridge would appear soon. But after another 20 minutes, I knew I was wrong. The trail ended. It didn't fade. It just ended in a tangle of thick brush and trees. No sign of a clearing, no sign of a ridge. Just the forest pressing in. I stood there, sweating, breathing hard, staring at the dead end. Panic pressed at the edges of my thoughts, but I forced myself to stay calm. I told myself I could backtrack, return to the fork, and take the other path. It wasn't too late. I turned around and started back. That was when I noticed how different the trail looked from this direction. I hadn't paid attention on the way here, too focused on pushing forward. Now everything looked the same. Trees, branches, patches of dirt. I kept walking, convinced I was retracing my steps, but after 10 minutes I realized the path had vanished. The ground beneath me was just forest floor, scattered with leaves and roots, and I couldn't see the clear trail I had walked earlier. I stopped, my heart pounding. I turned in a slow circle, looking for anything familiar, anything that looked like a trail, but it was just trees in every direction, tall and silent. I was lost. The realization sank into me like a weight. I reached into my pack, pulled out the map, unfolded it, and stared at it, but it was useless. The paper showed lines and symbols, but none of it matched the mess of trees surrounding me. I tried my phone, but the screen showed no service, just as before. The forest was silent now, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I picked a direction and started walking, hoping to find the trail again. My boots crunched over leaves, my backpack straps dug into my shoulders, and sweat dripped down my back. I told myself that if I just kept moving, I would cross the trail eventually. Couldn't be far, but the farther I went, the more it all blurred together. The trees looked the same, the ground the same. I found myself circling back to places I thought I had passed before. A fallen log with moss covering one side. A cluster of rocks shaped like a half circle. I couldn't tell if it was the same place or just something that looked similar. Hours passed. The sunlight shifted, angling lower through the branches. My legs ached, my throat dry even though I sipped at my water. The panic kept pushing up, threatening to take over, but I forced it down, kept moving, telling myself that if I stopped, I'd never find my way out. By late afternoon, I accepted the truth. I wasn't going to find the ridge. I wasn't even going to find the trail. My only chance was to keep heading downhill. I remembered reading once that following a downward slope in a forest could lead you to water, and water often led to roads or towns. It was something to cling to, so I started downward. The ground grew steeper, rocks jutting out, loose dirt sliding under my boots. I nearly slipped several times, catching myself on trees. My arms were scratched raw from branches. My water supply was running low, my food only half left. The sun dropped lower, the forest dimming. Shadows stretched long, the air cooling fast. I felt the temperature change immediately, the damp chill sinking into my skin. I knew I couldn't wander all night. I needed shelter. I found a small clearing with a cluster of rocks and decided it would have to do. I dropped my pack, pulled out the emergency blanket, and wrapped it around myself as I sat against a rock. I forced myself to eat a little jerky, drink a little water, but I kept most of it saved. I knew I had no idea how long I would be stuck out here. The night came quickly. The forest turned black, and every sound seemed louder. Branches creaked. Something moved through the leaves nearby, and I sat there in the dark, clutching the knife from my pack, listening. My heart hammered with every sound, my body tense, eyes wide though I could barely see. Sleep came in small bursts, shallow and restless. I always liked hiking alone. Something about the quiet, the steady rhythm of walking, the way the trees seemed to shut out the noise of the world. It gave me a strange kind of comfort. Most people I knew liked to hike in groups, but I didn't. I preferred hearing only the sound of my boots pressing into dirt and the occasional rustle of the woods. It made me feel free. That morning, the air was cool and smelled of damp leaves. I had driven out early while the sun was barely breaking over the horizon. The trail I picked was one I had never tried before. It was said to stretch through a forest, curve up toward a ridge, and then drop down near a stream that led back around. On the map, it looked like a long loop somewhere around 14 miles. Long enough to take most of the day, but not so long I would need to camp. I carried the basics: a backpack with water bottles, a first aid kit, a flashlight, some protein bars, an extra layer of clothes, a knife, and a lighter. I didn't bring my tent since I had no plans of staying the night. My phone was in my pocket, but I already knew service was spotty in this area. Still, I figured that added to the adventure. The first couple of miles were easy. The trail wound through thick trees with shafts of sunlight spilling through the leaves. The ground was damp but not muddy, soft enough to walk without feeling too much strain. I stopped every now and then to take in the smell of pine and earth. By the 4th mile, the trail grew steeper. My legs burned a little, and I found myself drinking more water. I liked the challenge, though. It felt like work, like something I had to push through. As I climbed, the trees thinned, and I got short glimpses of the valley below. It was beautiful, with rolling green hills stretching out far beyond the forest line. I thought about how far from people I must have been. That thought made me stop for a moment. It was silent. Completely silent. Usually, I heard birds or insects, but now there was nothing except the faint wind pushing through the trees. I told myself it was fine. Sometimes nature was just quiet. I kept moving. By the time I reached the ridge, the sky had shifted. Clouds were gathering in the distance, thick and gray. I checked the weather before I left that morning, and it only mentioned light rain, but the clouds looked heavier than that. The air felt cooler, too. I adjusted my pack and decided I'd better keep a good pace. I didn't want to get caught in a storm on the far end of the loop. The ridge gave me a wider view of the land, but it also made me realize how alone I was. The trail was empty in both directions. I hadn't seen a single hiker since I left the trailhead. I had the uneasy thought that if something happened to me, it could be hours before anyone came by. I shook it off and kept going. The descent down the other side of the ridge was rougher than the climb. The path was narrow and covered in loose stones. I slipped a couple of times but caught myself before falling. The trees grew denser again, and the light dimmed as clouds thickened overhead. I reached the stream just after midday. It was wider than I expected, with dark water moving quickly over slick rocks. A wooden bridge crossed it, though the planks looked worn and damp. I tested it before stepping fully onto it. It groaned but held. On the other side, the trail continued into darker woods. Something about that section of forest felt different. The The trees were taller, closer together, their branches almost knitting into a ceiling that blocked out most of the daylight. The ground was covered in thick layers of wet leaves that muffled the sound of my steps. I felt swallowed by it. I walked for what felt like an hour. My watch said it was only 40 minutes. The air grew colder, and the first drops of rain started to fall. At first, it was light, just enough to dampen my clothes, but soon it came harder, tapping against the leaves and dripping onto my neck. I pulled out my extra layer and kept going, hoping the canopy would block some of it. The trail became harder to follow. Rain washed away the dirt in some spots, leaving only roots and rocks. I noticed the markers on the trees seemed fewer and farther between. At one point, I stopped and turned in a slow circle, trying to spot the next one. For a few minutes, I couldn't find it, and my stomach tightened. When I finally saw the faded slash of paint on a tree about 20 yards ahead, I felt relief, but it didn't last long. The rain grew heavier, and fog started to creep in between the trees. It clung low to the ground, curling around the trunks and making the forest look endless. I pushed on, but my sense of direction was slipping. By late afternoon, my legs ached and my stomach growled. I stopped to eat a protein bar and drink some water, but when I checked my bottles, I realized I had only one full one left. I thought about refilling from the stream, but I didn't have purification tablets with me. The water had looked dark, fast, and probably not safe. I decided to ration what I had left. The trail seemed to stretch longer than the map suggested. I checked my watch again, and it told me I had been walking for nearly 8 hours. Even at a slow pace, I should have been closer to the end. I wondered if I had missed a turn. My chest tightened with unease. The rain slowed as the light faded, but the fog thickened. My clothes clung to me, and I felt a chill that wouldn't go away. My hands trembled slightly, not just from the cold, but from the realization that I might have gone off course. I kept moving, hoping each bend would bring me closer to a familiar landmark. Instead, the woods grew darker and thicker. The ground turned uneven, filled with dips and fallen branches. At one point, I stumbled hard over a root and went down on my knee. Pain shot up my leg. I cursed under my breath, grabbed my pack, and pushed myself back up. My knee throbbed, but I forced myself forward. When night finally came, it fell fast. The forest swallowed the last of the light, leaving me in darkness broken only by the beam of my flashlight. The fog reflected it back at me, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. My chest rose and fell faster, not just from walking but from the fear building inside me. I tried to calm down, telling myself I just had to keep going and I would eventually reach the end of the loop. But another part of me whispered that I had taken the wrong trail hours ago. The sounds of the forest changed at night. Branches creaked overhead, and something rustled in the undergrowth nearby. Every noise made me freeze. My light darted left and right, but I saw nothing. My breathing grew shallow. I had always liked the silence of the woods, but now it felt like the trees were holding their breath with me. I walked for what felt like hours in that darkness, my legs shaking with exhaustion, my throat dry. My flashlight beam flickered once, and panic surged through me. I tapped it, and it steadied, but I knew the batteries wouldn't last forever. Then I saw it, the bridge. The same worn wooden bridge over the stream. My stomach dropped. I realized I had been walking in a circle. My legs nearly gave out when I stepped onto it, the wood creaking under my weight. I crossed and stood there on the other side, staring into the woods I had already been through. I had lost the trail maybe more than once, and now I was back where I started hours ago. My watch said it was nearly midnight. I knew then I wouldn't make it out that night. My knee ached, my water was almost gone, and I was shivering in wet clothes. I pulled out the extra layer and wrapped it around myself, then found a spot against a tree to sit. The ground was cold and damp, but I had no choice. The night was long. Every sound in the forest felt close. Every crack of a branch made me snap my head up. I barely slept, jerking awake each time my body started to drift. My throat burned with thirst, and I rationed the last sips of water until morning. When light finally seeped through the trees, it was weak and gray. I stood on shaky legs, my whole body stiff. I decided to follow the stream instead of the trail. Streams usually led somewhere, roads, camps, or towns. My only thought was to keep moving downstream until I found something. It wasn't easy. The banks were slick, the rocks slippery, and my knees screamed each time I stumbled. Hours passed with no sign of anything human, just water rushing and trees pressing close. By mid-afternoon, I heard something different. A low hum, faint at first, then louder. My chest tightened as I realized it was the sound of a car. I pushed through the undergrowth, following the sound until I saw a clearing ahead. A road. I nearly cried when I stepped out onto the cracked asphalt. Cars weren't frequent, but I knew if I waited, one would come. I sat on the edge, exhausted, my clothes torn and my face streaked with dirt. When a vehicle finally appeared, slowing as it spotted me, I felt my whole body sag with relief. I was out. That night, back in my own bed, I lay awake thinking about how easily it all could have gone differently. A few more hours without water, another wrong turn, or a dead flashlight, and I might not have made it. The trail had been beautiful, but it also reminded me of something I had forgotten. Nature doesn't care about you. It doesn't try to comfort or hurt you. It just is. And if you're not